in articles published in the Afghan Historical Society's journal. Afghanistan History and Civilization. Dr. Noura Khalidi critically analyzed a book by Abdul Khalik Lalzad that challenges historical narratives about Afghanistan. The analysis accuses Lalzad of distorting history, particularly regarding the origin and identity of Afghans and the country's borders. It argues that Lalzad's work promotes a pro-Iranian agenda and aims to undermine national unity by questioning Afghanistan's historical existence before certain political figures and treaties. The author refutes Lalzad's claims using various historical documents and scholarly sources. The analysis further suggests Lalzad's views are rooted in ethnic prejudice and a disregard for Afghanistan's diverse heritage and independent history, including defending itself against imperial powers. The text ultimately condemns Lalzad's alleged attempts to diminish Afghan national identity. The following audio discourse is a deep dive review of the arguments provided in the above. Critique refuting Lalzad's attempts to diminish Afghan history.
All right, let's dive in. This time we're tackling the history of Afghanistan, which looks like it's going to be a doozy.
It's a fascinating topic for sure.
You know, with all these sources, like this one here, clear we're in for quite a deep dive. You want to know where the name Afghanistan even comes from, separate fact from fiction and its history, and understand this complex relationship between Pashtun identity and Afghan nationality.
It's quite a lot to untangle.
Yeah, heavy stuff. But that's what we're here for.
Absolutely. And it seems like you've been digging into the works of Abdul Khalik Lalzad.
Yeah, especially his book. The critique in Eyasekanesi Ekintan Ehif really got me thinking.
His work is definitely thought-provoking.
To say the least. Lalzad argues that Afghanistan as we know it today is basically like a modern invention. He even goes as far as to say its history is fabricated and that Afghans should only refer to the Pashtun people.
Ah, yes, Lalzad's work often sparks debate. It's interesting that you noticed his use of numerous quotes and citations. While this might seem to suggest thorough research at first glance, the critique raises some potential issues with his methods and potential biases, something to keep in mind as we go forward.
Okay, so red flag number one, but let's get into the specifics. One of the things Lalzad claims is that Afghan actually means cries of pain in Persian.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that Persian speakers used it to describe the Pashtuns almost like an insult.
To understand that claim, it's crucial to consider the historical context globally today. So non-Pashtun groups using Afghan might simply reflect that it was, the common language they used when interacting with Pashtuns, not necessarily a derogatory term.
That makes a lot more sense. But Lalzad doesn't stop there. He points to the presence of Afghan tribes in 15th century Kerman in Iran, and even al-Biruni's writings about Afghan communities in the Suleiman Mountains as evidence against a unified Pashtun identity.
It's important to remember that groups and identities were much more fluid back then. The presence of Afghan communities outside modern-day Afghanistan doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't a shared identity among Pashtuns in the broader region.
Okay, so let's move on to another big claim Lalzad makes, that Afghanistan as a political entity didn't even exist before Abdurrahman Khan in the late 19th century. To back this up, he makes this wild comparison. He says, using that logic, modern Turkey's history only began after World War I, and India's in 1947.
Well, that's a very oversimplified way of looking at history, wouldn't you say? Countries and their names evolve over time.
Yeah, I guess so.
Think about Ceylon changing to Sri Lanka or Persia to Iran. These changes don't erase their history. It's more about understanding the continuity and change over time, not drawing these arbitrary lines.
Right. It seems like Lalzad's trying to fit history into a very specific box. And then there's the whole issue of him questioning Afghanistan's 5,000-year history, which the critique really tears apart.
Of course. We have tons of archaeological evidence of civilizations going back millennia in the area. The Achaemenids, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, the Kushans. These were powerful empires in what is now Afghanistan, independent of Persian or Indian empires. Their connection to the region is undeniable.
So Lalzad doesn't buy into this idea of a unified Afghan identity before Abdurrahman Khan. But from what I've gathered, the critique you found cites historical accounts and maps that actually recognize Afghanistan way before then.
Exactly. You've got George Forster, for example. He traveled through Afghanistan in the late 18th century, writing about it in his book, Journey from Bengal to England. This was well before any significant British influence, which directly contradicts that idea that they invented Afghanistan.
And there's Mount Stuart Elphinstone's, an account of the Kingdom of Kabul from the early 19th century. He also uses the term Afghanistan and even describes its diverse population, clearly suggesting it was a recognized entity back then.
Precisely. These accounts clearly show that Afghanistan was already recognized as a distinct place, geographically and politically, before the British got involved.
Which really messes with Lalzad's narrative, right? It suggests Afghan identity and the idea of Afghanistan weren't just imposed by outsiders.
Exactly. Adds a whole new dimension to the story, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. But there's one last piece of this puzzle that I found interesting. Lalzad also brings up the Durand Line, which was established in 1893. He argues that it unfairly gave large portions of Pashtun territory to British India, which later became part of Pakistan.
The Durand Line is definitely a source of historical tension, especially for Pashtun communities. However, it doesn't invalidate the existence of Afghanistan as a nation. Think of it like France losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. It was a significant event, but it didn't erase French history or identity.
That's a good analogy. So while the Durand Line is important, it doesn't negate everything else we've learned about Afghan history.
Right. It's one piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle.
And that's where the critique really makes its point. It suggests that while Lalzad raises some thought-provoking questions about Afghan identity, his work seems more focused on pushing a specific perspective rather than presenting a truly balanced view of history.
That's a crucial insight for anyone trying to understand this complex topic. It highlights the importance of critical thinking when engaging with historical narratives.
It's like we've peeled back the first layer of the onion, and there's still so much more to uncover.
Absolutely. But we'll dive into those deeper layers in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. So this deep dive has really shown how complex Afghan history is. One thing that keeps popping up is how Lalzad seems to downplay the contributions of, non-Pashtun groups to Afghan identity.
Yes, that's another point highlighted in the critique. Yes, cosa que es the silkon sinusayad the anchi SEBDF. Lalzad presents this picture where Afghan history is almost entirely a Pashtun story, with everyone else just playing like a minor role.
And as we've been discussing, that's a pretty skewed view of the actual historical record, right? We know Afghanistan has always been this diverse land with contributions from tons of different groups.
Absolutely. To really understand Afghan history, we need to move beyond this narrow perspective and appreciate the tapestry of cultures and influences that have shaped the region.
So, to kind of counter this narrative of Pashtun dominance, where should we look? What are some key periods or events that highlight the impact of non-Pashtun groups?
Well, we can start with the pre-Islamic era. The area we call Afghanistan today was this crossroads of empires and cultures for centuries. The Achaemenid Empire, for instance, controlled parts of the region, and you can still see their influence in art and architecture from that time.
Right. And then there's the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, which flourished after Alexander the Great. They built incredible cities like Ai-Khanoum, blending Greek and Central Asian elements in a way that you can still see in Afghanistan today.
Exactly. Ai-Khanoum is a perfect example of how different cultures interacted and kind of enriched each other in the ancient Afghanistan. It really challenges this idea that Afghan identity was ever just one thing.
So even before Islam, Afghanistan was already this place where different cultures met and mingled.
Precisely. And this continued after Islam arrived. Early Islamic dynasties, like the Saffarids and Ghaznavids, who ruled from parts of modern-day Afghanistan, were themselves multi-ethnic and relied on people from diverse backgrounds.
The critique specifically mentions the Ghaznavids and their influence on, spreading Persian language and culture.
Yes, the Ghaznavid court was a major center of learning and scholarship. They supported poets and writers, contributing a ton to Persian literature. A famous example is Ferdowsi, who wrote the epic poem Shahnameh. He was very closely associated with the Ghaznavid court.
So they weren't just powerful rulers, but also patrons of the arts.
Exactly. And their influence wasn't limited to literature. The Ghaznavids were prolific builders, leaving behind amazing mosques and palaces. Their architectural legacy is still visible today in places like Ghazni in Afghanistan, which was their capital.
Wow. That's impressive. So the Ghaznavids are a clear example of a non-Pashtun dynasty leaving a long-lasting mark on Afghan history and culture.
Absolutely. And speaking of influential dynasties, you can't forget the Timurids. They ruled this vast empire that included parts of Afghanistan in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Right. Timur, or Tamerlane as he's sometimes called, is a legendary figure. He was of Turco-Mongol origin but embraced Persian culture. His descendant, Babur, went on to found the Mughal Empire in India, but before that, the Timurids had a big impact on Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Their capital, Samarkand, was known as this center of art, architecture, and science. You can still see the Timurids' influence in the mosques and mausoleums of Herat in western Afghanistan, for example. Their architectural style is really stunning.
It seems like every corner of Afghanistan has a story to tell. So to kind of push back against Lalzad's claims, the Timurids give us another example of non-Pashtun groups playing a key role in shaping Afghan history.
Yes, precisely. Their story highlights how important various groups were to the political and cultural landscape of Afghanistan, adding more nuance to what we know about the region.
So we've established that this idea of Pashtun dominance just doesn't hold up when we look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And this trend continued in later centuries. Take the Hotak dynasty in the 18th century, for example. They were Pashtun, but they incorporated a lot of Persian language and culture into their administration. They even managed to capture Isfahan, the Safavid capital in Persia, for a while.
Wait, the Safavids, who were they exactly?
Oh, right. The Safavids were this dynasty that ruled Persia from the 16th to 18th centuries. They were major players in the region and were crucial in establishing Shia Islam as the dominant religion in Persia.
So, the fact that the Hotaks, who were a Pashtun dynasty, were able to capture the Safavid capital shows their influence went beyond what we might think of as Afghan territory.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected the region was. Groups we might categorize today as Pashtun or Persian were interacting and influencing each other.
And then, of course, there's Ahmad Shah Durrani, who's considered the founder of modern Afghanistan. While he was Pashtun, he was also really into Persian culture and understood the importance of uniting all the different ethnic groups.
Yes, his court was well known for its Persian poetry and literature. He recognized that Afghanistan's strength was in its diversity, not in making one group more important than others.
It's amazing to see how all these different threads, Pashtun, Persian, Turkic, Mongol, have been woven together throughout Afghanistan's history.
It really is remarkable. To try and reduce Afghan identity to just one ethnicity is to completely miss this richness and complexity.
Which makes Lalzad's arguments even more confusing. He's trying to oversimplify something that's inherently complex.
Yes, and in doing so, he's promoting a very limited view of Afghan identity that just isn't supported by history.
So for our listener who's been looking into these sources, it's super important to keep this broader context in mind. Afghanistan has never been a monolithic entity, culturally or ethnically.
Exactly. To understand Afghanistan, you need to embrace this complexity and diversity. It's what makes it such a fascinating and important place to study.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot, but there's still more to explore, especially the political stuff we touched on earlier.
You're right. We'll get more into that in the last part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Afghanistan's history and the whole idea of Afghan identity. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's one more layer I think we need to look at, and that's the political side of things.
Yeah, you can't really talk about history without acknowledging, politics and power dynamics. And in Afghanistan, those influences are especially strong, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It feels like Lalzad's work, whether he meant to or not, kind of plays into some of those political tensions that we see today. His whole focus on Pashtun dominance and kind of pushing other groups to the side seems to, well, echo certain political agendas.
You're right to point that out. It is concerning how he uses history, or at least parts of it, to promote a very specific idea of Afghan identity, one that could definitely be seen as, like, fueling existing divisions.
And that's where it gets tricky, right? We need to be aware of potential biases, but at the same time, there are legitimate historical grievances that we can't just ignore. Like the Durand Line, for example. It's had such a lasting impact on Pashtun communities and continues to be a source of tension even today.
Absolutely. The Durand Line, which was drawn by the British in the late 1800s, basically cut right through Pashtun territories. And those divisions have had huge consequences.
It's more than just a line on a map. It's about families being separated, cultural ties being broken, and just this sense of injustice that I think fuels a lot of resentment, even now.
Right. And those feelings are completely valid. But it's important not to fall into the trap of thinking that history controls everything, which is kind of what Lalzad seems to do. Acknowledging past injustices doesn't mean we're doomed to conflict or stuck with a single version of the story.
So how do we approach this in a way that's, balanced? How can we try to understand these complexities, including the influence of politics and power, without just resorting to oversimplified narratives or, essentializing entire groups of people?
It's a tough question, but it's an important one. I think it takes critical thinking, nuanced analysis, and a willingness to really engage with different perspectives, even ones that challenge our own assumptions.
That's harder than it sounds, though, especially with something as sensitive as identity and national belonging. It feels like everyone has a stake in how history is told.
Exactly. We have to be so careful, so aware of the ways history can be used to manipulate or to push a specific agenda. It's our job to really think critically about the information we come across, to question the motivations behind the stories we're being told.
So this deep dive, it's not just about Afghanistan then. It's also about how history itself gets constructed, contested, and sometimes even used as a weapon.
You got it. It's a good reminder that history isn't this fixed objective truth. It's an ongoing process, really. A process of interpretation, debate, and reevaluation. And as engaged citizens, it's up to us to participate in that process in a thoughtful, critical way.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the final message we want to leave our listener with?
As you continue to explore this topic, which I encourage you to do, keep in mind what you've learned here. Afghan identity is made up of so many different things, so many influences. Don't shy away from that complexity. Embrace the messiness and the nuance. Keep questioning your assumptions, exploring different points of view, and most importantly, keep asking questions.
Well said. And hey, remember, folks, this is just one deep dive. There's a whole ocean of knowledge out there just waiting to be explored. Who knows what other historical mysteries are out there? Keep those deep dive requests coming.